for joining us. This evening we have J. Ryan Stradal with us, and he has been selected for our One Book, One Community author and title. This year, the title is The Lager Queen of Minnesota, and this book is a great book. It really captures the values and the beauty of the Midwest and a multi-generational story of community and family. And we're so happy to have the author with us. We also need to acknowledge we have a few sponsors that have helped us with this. And a major sponsor for the 2020 project would be the Friends of the Fargo Public Library. Also, we have the Clean Water and Land and Legacy Act, and that is from Minnesota. Concordia College in Minnesota has also sponsored us, and the Friends of the West Fargo Public Library and the Friends of the Moorhead Public Library. And I should also mention our partners for this. So the Fargo Public Library, the Moorhead Public Library, the West Fargo Public Library, the Concordia College Library, NDSU Libraries, and the Moorhead State University Library, as well as Community Education for Moorhead and the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. So this is always such a fun project, and we are just thrilled to have you with us today. This is the 9th year of doing it, and we so wish we could have brought you to Fargo/Moorhead this year, and I still hold out hope that in a future year, future time, we can get you here and do this in person, because I know we have a great number of followers in the community for these events, and they definitely love to see the author and ask questions in person. With that, though, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, Lori, and thank you so much for having me here. I agree. I really wish I could be there in person for a lot of reasons. First of all, I've yet to go to Fargo or Moorhead on a book tour yet. And I was hoping this would be it. This would be a wonderful introduction to the area as an author, but also as an author, as a person. I've got background in Fargo. My mom was born in Fargo in 1950, and her family grew up in a small town called Hunter, about an hour or so west. And I spent a lot of time in North Dakota as a kid, coming up there to visit these relatives on my mom's side of the family. My great grandma Johnson lived in Hunter until she passed away, and as did my great aunt Sissy. And I would see them whenever I could, and they were huge early supporters of me in my writing, and and yeah, just innumerably helpful people, and the sort of people that created the model for some of the women in my books. And it's a real honor to be here and talk with you. And thank you so much for selecting me. And like I said, I wish I could be there in person, but I know I will in the future. And so I'm looking forward to meeting you in real life when I can. But yeah, I grew up in Hastings, Minnesota, in the southeastern part of the state between St. Paul and Red Wing on the Mississippi. And, raised by parents who are big readers. And my mom especially was a huge reader, a huge influence on my life as a writer. She went back to college at University of Wisconsin River Falls when I was a little boy. And she would read her bedtime stories, read her homework to me as a bedtime story, like her reading assignments and stuff, stuff like James Joyce or Jorge Luis Borges or Canterbury Tales, as a means of double tasking or multitasking the demands of motherhood and college student. She was completing her bachelor's degree. She had dropped out of college in the early 70s from UMD, and always wanted to complete that English degree and be a writer herself. So, unbeknownst to her, she was raising one. Yeah, I saw my mom reading novels around the house, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. And also, it put in my mind that the most important thing that you could do as an adult the thing that would impress your parents the most would be if you wrote a novel. So as a little kid, I took my favorite book at the time, which was Richard Scarry's Cars and Trucks and Things That Go, and written by Ryan Stradal on the inside cover. And I presented that to my mom, and I said, "Here's my novel." And well, she quickly disabused me of a lifetime of plagiarism. She said, "You've got you've got to write the words yourself and make up the stories yourself." And so, after thinking about that for a few minutes, I decided that sounded fine. In fact, that sounded pretty good. I had ideas for stories, and eventually I got to write them. In grade school, the first time I was given an assignment to write a story, I just ran with it. I wrote a story called The Party. It was 11 pages long, single-spaced, pencil on line paper. And I think the teacher was floored, but before, she got too impressed, and before anyone should be, I should note that 8 of those 11 pages were a list of people invited to the party. So I had a lot to learn about plot, narrative, character development, but I knew I wanted to populate my fictional worlds with as many people as possible and be super inclusive. And I think that impulse has spilled over to my current writing, where I find myself cutting characters late into the edits or cutting books down from much larger sizes to the size that ends up being published. So after that, I started writing more on my own, started writing fiction, short stories, and really enjoyed any opportunity to do it as an assignment during school. I thought about being an English major, a creative writing major, but I ended up, at my father's urging, majoring in radio, TV, film in college, just to have that semi-pragmatic backup in case I couldn't make a living as a writer. And well, I ended up using that degree for most of my adult life. After going to college at Northwestern in Illinois and getting that degree in radio, TV, film, I moved to Los Angeles, where I followed a professor out who had a job he said I should interview for. And I didn't get the job, but was now stuck in LA, having moved there. And so I stuck it out and interviewed a lot. And after 6 months, I got a job and ended up working at VH1, where reality television was just coming into existence. This was in the late 90s. And I ended up working as a writer and producer for reality TV for the next 15 years. I worked on early seasons of The Bachelorette, Tristan Ryan's Wedding, a show called Outback Jack. And later on, during the last half of my career, I worked entirely for original productions on shows like Deadliest Catch, Ice Road Truckers, and Storage Wars. I was working on a spinoff of Storage Wars called Storage Wars Texas when I finally started writing my first novel, Kitchens, The Great Midwest. And Kitchens takes place in a variety of areas around the Midwest. Each chapter takes place in a different area, often a different state, and highlights a different food. What I set out to do with Kitchens, The Great Midwest, was to write a recipe for a human being. I got the idea when I was at a dinner party, and I realized that everyone there knew the host, but most of us didn't know each other. And I thought, how did this group of people get assembled? And what do each of us say individually about this host, about this person that's united us, who's the hub of our wheel, in which we're all spokes? How would we each describe this person, or how we met? And how do we collectively compose her identity? I thought about that in 2009, and it was 5 years before I started writing. 4 or 5 years before I started writing the book. And I set out to make each chapter oriented around a different ingredient and have all those ingredients served in a meal at the end, with most of the people you meet along the way who tell the stories of this person also represented at that meal. So you find yourself reading this book as if it's a recipe and being served the accumulation of those ingredients in the dish that's the final chapter. So that's Kitchens of the Great Midwest. And I was very fortunate with that book that it became a New York Times bestseller, and it enabled me to travel around the country for and overseas even for a few years, promoting it and reading from it. And while doing that, I I found myself in the Midwest quite a bit. Yeah, you put the word Midwest in a title, and that's where you're likely to go. And I feel very, very blessed for it because it's my home region, and I miss it quite a bit. And I wrote this book, wrote that debut novel out of a pretty big sense of homesickness, and also a desire to see the Midwest represented in fiction more often, which when I was a kid growing up, I didn't see all that much. You know, people like John Hassler, Tim O'Brien, Louise Erdrich, but not with the frequency I would have liked. So I was very eager to add to that conversation when I started developing my skills as a writer in my 20s and 30s, when I finally started taking writing more seriously in my late 20s and going to night school classes at UCLA to learn the craft of fiction with more intent and discipline. I started thinking, well, what's important to me? Because as a kid and teenager and in my early 20s, I wrote a lot, but I wrote stories that I would consider to be amusing or, you know, meant for a crowd, meant to make people laugh. Finally, I had an instructor named Lou Matthews who said, you know, once you start writing things that are important to you, you're going to get good. And I took that to heart. So that to me meant writing about the Midwest, writing about where I was from, and writing about my mom, who, like I said earlier, was a huge influence on my writing and passed away in 2005, 10 years before Kitchens was published. So I sat down to write this book, to write the book that she might have liked had she lived to see it, you know, a book that she would have enjoyed reading, and a book that would have hopefully made her proud. And I brought that impulse to my second book as well, The Lager Queen of Minnesota. But The Lager Queen of Minnesota was also influenced by my tour for Kitchens, where I would find myself in cities, mid-sized cities, larger towns, smaller towns throughout the Great Lakes and the upper Midwest. And I'd roll into these towns, many of which I'd never been to before, hadn't been to in a long time. And people would say, "Oh, have you been to the brewery?" I go, "Well, no, I haven't been in this town before." But it was very clear that to me from that question that the brewery was a significant pride of place in the hearts of the people who lived in this town. And I found myself increasingly attracted to these breweries, not just as an enthusiastic beer drinker, but as a topic for a book. I thought, what kinds of people are in these breweries? Who open them? Why are they here? In some of the smaller towns, they might account for perhaps the only or one of just a very few independent or locally owned and operated restaurants or industries. And I thought, well, what a cool phenomenon to be emerging at this point in time where so many of our towns and cities are colonized by chains, and the homogeneity that affects on a community. You know, roll in from city to city or town to town and see the same restaurants and stores. Well, the thing with these independent craft breweries is that there's a real mission behind them to make them not identical. Each brewer seems very motivated to create something that can't be found anywhere else, to create something that's a real fingerprint for that community, whether if that means hiring local people, using local ingredients when possible, or just making the kind of beer that they can't find in that community otherwise. It's something that emerges as a really distinct fingerprint and marker for that town. And I was so impressed with that. And also so impressed with the attitude in which these breweries were emerging. It reminded me a lot of the beer halls I'd seen in Germany that were more open, sunny, family-friendly, pet-friendly, and activity-friendly, where these breweries were becoming sort of de facto community centers and not just bars. Growing up in a small river town, a bar to me was a scary place that adults hung out at. And just by driving past them as a kid, they didn't seem like a place that held a lot of fascination or appeal to me. They didn't seem particularly inviting. to a bookish young kid in southeastern Minnesota. And so these breweries definitely, these modern breweries, definitely seem to be a reaction to that in terms of creating a more generous atmosphere and a more versatile and agile atmosphere that has game nights, trivia nights, musicians, meeting places, community groups, places to watch football. It's been so cool to see them emerge, not just in our home region, but around the country. And so I was so motivated to write about that. But I was also motivated to write about women in brewing. I hadn't met many while researching the book, and I didn't see a great reason for that naively, because from the research I'd done by then, I learned that women invented brewing, and women were the main people making beer in a community for thousands of years. And although now the tide is starting to turn, and through mentorship programs like the Pink Boot Society, which has chapters in many American cities, more women brewers are emerging throughout the country. At the time I was researching the book, I didn't meet as many, and I wanted to write about women brewers, not only because, well, as a fiction writer, you get to write what you want, you get to create the world you want to exist, but also because I knew this book would have female main characters, because once again, like with my first book, I wanted to write about my mom and for her and to her. I feel like a lot of my books are a conversation with her, where, I'm trying to tell her how I'm doing, what's important in my life. And I'm trying to evoke her in these characters. So naturally, the characters come out as female quite a bit. There's a character in my second book here, Edith. She opens the book. There's a lot of my mom in her. There's a lot of my mom's mom, Doris, in her, and a little bit of my dad's mom, Esther, in her as well. So in short, like three of the most important women in my life are in this character. In some ways, in some really obvious ways, like the fact that my grandmother, Doris Johnson Beale, who's from Hunter, worked as a dietary aide at a nursing home much of her adult life, just as Edith does, but also in their mannerisms, their values, the way they see the world, the way they communicate with people, and also the stubbornness and the grudges they hold and the reasons they hold those grudges. I wanted to put that complexity that I witnessed in the Midwestern women that I loved, that influenced me, that made me who I am today, that made me a writer, into this character. So I'll introduce you to her. I'll introduce you to Edith just a little bit here and read from the very beginning of the book from a chapter called $20,000. It takes place in 2003. It was July 5th, 2003, and Edith Magson's day hadn't been too bad so far. She'd just taken a strawberry rhubarb pie from the oven and was looking for her favorite tea towel when she saw a grasshopper on the white trim of her windowsill. She didn't like the idea of that bug sitting there all vulnerable, so she gently poked at it with the handle of a wooden spoon. As she'd hoped, it leapt into the yard and vanished into the safety of the green grass. Edith felt herself exhale. Then she felt terrible. Maybe that little bug just wanted a vacation somewhere, and then she came along and ruined everything. Edith, for one, never once really had a vacation anywhere, never once really truly had a break of any kind. But then again, she never intended to take one. After all, things were pretty decent where she was, and she'd never see the point about belly aching about the things she couldn't change, especially in a world that has never once ran a want ad looking for a complainer. After all, Edith had a good job at St. Anthony Waterside Nursing Home, a few blocks from her rented two-bedroom Rambler in the central Minnesota town of New Stockholm. She also had a husband, Stanley, who at that point was in a Peterbilt somewhere in South Dakota. She had an adult son, Eugene, who at that point was just starting off as an independent distributor for an interesting company called Lifewell, which apparently sold quality household products directly to consumers at value prices. She also had an adult daughter, Colleen, who'd gone to college, and even though she had to drop out, had done okay for herself. Colleen had married a handyman named Mark, who was a kind man, even if he didn't go to church. They were raising Edith's sole grandchild, a smart, curious girl named Diana, who was somehow almost a teenager already. If all this wasn't everything a person needed, Edith didn't know what would be. It was true she missed the farm where she grew up, missed her parents for one reason and his sister for another reason, but it was no use dwelling on things and people that were in the past. Edith was only 64 years old, but if she died right then, she would have felt the most important things that a person, a woman or a man in the Midwest can feel at the end of their lives. She'd done what she could, and she'd done what she could, and she was of use. She'd helped. So that's Edith. And like I said, she's modeled after many of the women in my life who helped, who did what they could, who saw a situation and, like Edith does throughout the book, finds a subtle way to be of use and improve it if it needs improving. Just like my own grandmother would sometimes bring in desserts for the residents at the nursing home where she worked, or bring in my brother and I to visit the residents who never had visitors. Edith does things like that, both in the nursing home and throughout her life. And this subtle, non-self-congratulatory, very matter-of-fact way of improving her community and the people around her life is something that I grew up around. And I frankly wasn't seeing it in a lot of books. It seems that there's a lot of dystopian literature out there right now and a lot of unlikable narrators. And, and that's fine for people who want to read that, but I don't at the moment. I wanted to read something with good people. And, I was going to put them through the ringer. After all, it's a story. There has to be a plot. I just wanted to see people like the people I knew growing up represented in literature more often. And the result of that is Edith. But the result of that is also her sister Helen, who represents a different kind of Midwesterner, an ambitious one, a quietly, what's the word? Someone who's very, very determined, but doesn't necessarily toot their own horn about it. Someone who's a little bit of a sub rosa, let's see, a dream chaser, for lack of a better term. This is a person who, like a few people I've known in my life, knew what they wanted to do at a young age and pursued it instantly, like with just a laser focus. I've always admired those people because even though I knew what I wanted to do at a young age, I didn't develop that laser focus. It took me a while to develop the confidence and willpower and discipline to be a writer. I really loved writing and I did it whenever I could, but I didn't have a great deal of confidence in my work. I just saw a tremendous gulf in the quality between what I was writing and what I was reading. And I didn't pretend to think that anyone would care about what I was writing or what I had to say. But thankfully, through a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of rejection slips from magazines, I got better at it. And even as I developed more confidence and developed my skill and discipline, I still would look with envy at people like Helen, who I'm about to read from now, and I'd think, man, how different my life would be if I'd been like that, if I just had a little bit more gumption and self-heroism earlier in my life and started this earlier. So instead I write about them. And so as such, I put a lot of my heart into these characters too. Some people view Helen, due to the circumstances in this book, as an antagonist or a bad person. And I don't. I view her as a person who made the choices she made for the reasons she did, and she believes she's right. I think that she could have been less selfish or a little more self-aware, sure, but I think that she was a person who knew that no one was going to hand her dreams to her, and as such, ferociously pursued them. And I do think that at the end of the day, she didn't set out to hurt people doing it. And she had her heart in the right place for much of this journey. But there are still things she could have done differently. One thing that I think she does do successfully is figure out how to sell light beer to Midwesterners. And I'll tell you that story right now. Helen Orville took out a small loan to help buy ad space and produce local spots. And even would suck up over half the funds, Orville was still convinced that they needed a celebrity pitch man for their new product, Blott's Special Light. This is where their friend, Joe Foxworth, proved his value. Hey, I know a guy, Joe told Helen one afternoon in the office, just as she was leaving the executive bathroom. My brother's freshman year roommate at Augustana was in training camp with the Minnesota Vikings. His name's Rudd Herzog. He said he'd do it. Helen wasn't really listening, so she was impressed. Your brother has a friend on the Vikings? Well, he didn't make the team, Joe said, but he lasted until final cuts. Oh, so he's not actually on the team then? No, but he's a big guy. He still looks like a football player. But he isn't one, Helen said. And nobody's heard of him. Well, no, Joe said, but trust me. Using his own money, Joe shot a spec commercial with Rudd Herzog, which Helen Orville weren't even aware of until he showed it to them on his home film projector. Joe flicked off the lights, pulled down a screen, and the image of a giant bearded man wearing an unspecific football jersey appeared before them. Hi, I'm Rudd Herzog. You probably don't remember me from my career on the Minnesota Vikings. It was my lifelong dream to play for them, and last year I had my one chance, and I didn't make it. That was real depressing. We've all had days like that, I guess. But after getting cut, I felt like drinking a lot of beer. Thank goodness my local bar had Blott's Special Light. With its easygoing flavor and low calories, you can drink a ton of them. You can drink it all night and you'll feel all right. Drink lots, it's Blott's. Kind of sad, Helen said. I don't know. Well, I like it, said her husband, Orville. I think he speaks for a lot of people right now. Joe nodded. Yeah, I sure hope he does. All right. So that's a little bit from Helen Blott's, Edith's sister, and two family members whose course of action and decisions throughout this book tell the story. The third person who comes in about halfway, I won't read from because I think it's a little hard without giving things away. Her name's Diana. She's Edith's granddaughter, and she helps complete the story. And I love Diana. Diana, as a character, is inspired on part by my friend Diana Kowalski from Mabel, Minnesota, but also she's probably the character that has the most me in her, and a few other people, including some of the brewers I've met along the way. And Diana's an intriguing person, like that's completely her own voice, totally distinct from Edith and Helen, but also Midwestern. And she's she's the one who brings in the modern brewery information and settings. Since much of the book is set in Helen's era, we meet Helen in the 1950s when she has her first taste of lager, which is from Fitgers at the time in 1957. And therefore she sets out to create a lager brewery in the realm of Grain Belt or Schmidt or Blatz. Yeah. Or perhaps Blue Ribbon, Shells, etc. And she does that. And so throughout that section of the book, there's a lot of lager, Pilsner, light beer, and history as it relates to the upper Midwest and how those trends rose and fell during the Upper Midwest. And by the time Diana comes into the story, she finds her way into brewing, and it's the modern craft independent brewers that she represents. So it was a joy for me to be able to write, to an extent, a history of the last 50 years or so of Midwestern beer and infuse it through the story. Now, the research for that obviously was extremely difficult and very taxing. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do, travel around the Upper Midwest and drink beer. Really, really good beer, quite a bit, and try to also tell the stories of these brewers I met and influence the narrative, and Diana's narrative in particular, with some of this information. But, I didn't want the book to become too overloaded with brewery facts. I didn't want it to be like Moby Dick of beer, where every other chapter is a list of IPAs. So I found myself doing a lot of the research as I was writing, where a character would come to a situation that I didn't know the answer to. For example, late in the book, there's a character who's making a chocolate stout for the first time. But this character has no previous history of brewing anything, let alone chocolate stout. So I thought, well, it's pretty unlikely that she'd get it right the first time. And even though she has professional facilities and help around her, she's not flying blind. I wanted her to make a beginner's mistake with chocolate stout. I just didn't know what that would be. So at that point, I had to go to a brewery that had chocolate stout, try it out, and talk to the person who made it about how they arrived at that recipe, what are honest beginner mistakes one could make while making that variety, and how long it took them to make it, both in terms of perfecting that specific recipe and how long it takes even after you get it down. There are some parts of the book that some people consider to be an exaggeration, other people consider to be absolutely true in terms of the amount of beer one might have to make before one considers themselves a brewer, or one's beer is fit for consumption by strangers. So, yeah, I hope to open some debate in that realm. I hope by writing this book, I've represented the beer in the Midwest and the people in the Midwest the best I could. I'm not trying to write any kind of definitive volume of what Midwesterners are like, just trying to add to the conversation already out there with so many wonderful books set in the Midwest, from Midwestern authors from, Michigan to North Dakota down to Missouri. I feel like it's a region with a lot of variety and a lot more beauty and intelligence and resourcefulness than we sometimes get credit for from coastal media. So I really wanted to put a lot of that heart and smarts and guts into these characters, and exactly, do my best to write a book that I want to read right now. Being that, as I said earlier, I'm not particularly motivated to read anything dystopian. I just want to see more books out there about good people and in an environment that I wanted to see represented in literature. So I hope you do too, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, and I'm hopefully looking forward to meeting you in person sometime. Until then, thanks so much for participating and watching this tonight. And now I believe Lori West from the library has a few questions that people have sent in already, and I'm ready for them.
All right, thank you. That was great to hear. And I think we did enjoy just a story about good people we recognize too. Being from Fargo-Moorhead area, there's definitely moments when you're reading the book like I know an Edith, or someone who has pieces of Edith in her. So it's great fun book for everyone. You talked a little bit about the book being dedicated or pulling from Doris and Esther, grandmothers of yours, and that was really cool. So could you elaborate a little bit more about the reason you dedicated the book to them?
Yeah, one of the main reasons was not only because of their influence on my life and their support of me as a person and their love for me as a person and as a writer, but also because I wanted to see more stories uh, that centered women of a certain age that were vital and um, doing important things and new things late into their life. Like we meet Edith when she's 64, and we follow her for another 15 years in this book. And it was really fun for me to write about someone between the ages of 64 and 79 who's enjoying a renaissance in her life and is doing new things for the first time and doing them well and setting out in some cases with a few of these characters doing something they'd never done before, something they never could have imagined doing, and enjoying it and taking and feeling a new ownership uh, over their life and their identity because of it. Because I've seen that happen in my own life. I've seen growing up in the Midwest, I had still have a lot of relatives, women in particular, working well into their late 70s, doing, either continuing an old job and quite often starting a new one. And like my grandmother, for example, well, Doris got her driver's license at age 57. And I always thought that was tremendously impressive that at that age, she said, well, it's time for me to move myself around when I want, how I want, and I really love that. And I was really, really moved by a lot of the experiences I had growing up with these women who had very vital and engaged lives and were very active in their communities well into their 80s. And I just wasn't seeing a lot of those stories in fiction. Certainly a lot of media is very content to portray older people as like comic relief or as, insufficient to the task in front of them in one way or another. And that's not my experience at all. So I really wanted to show, without giving too much away about the book, have a chapter near the end where a group of women of a certain age really take control of something and master it and take ownership of it and are good at it and love it. Yeah. It's a kind of thing I wanted to read. So I wasn't seeing it out there. So I had to write it myself.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. The next question. So, beer. Are you a home brewer yourself or just a connoisseur? Also, have you tried to brew any of the Artemis beers yourself?
Oh, wow. No, I haven't yet. I'm not a home brewer, at least not yet. My wife won't let me do it in our current place. I'm in the process of moving, so maybe in the new place there will be space for it. But one of the things I kept coming into information wise when interviewing brewers was when I'd ask them what influenced you to open a brewery, quite often they'd say, oh, I needed to make the beer I wanted to drink. And that's not really the case for me right now. I mean, I can find the varieties of beer I enjoy readily in a store, even during a pandemic. So there isn't that motivation like, oh, I've got to create the beer I like because no one else is making it. And that was a motivation for a lot of the brewers that started up, especially, 10 to 20 years ago. The first wave of craft brewers was in large part these types of people, or people that experienced beer in another part of the country or another country and wanted to make that style and couldn't buy it in the store. Because, well, I can pretty easily through one venue or another get a lot of the beer I enjoy. I don't have to make it. Certainly less time consuming to buy it. I'd like to. I think it would be fun, but just haven't lived anywhere yet where I could get away with it. And as far as a connoisseur, I don't know. I only just now joined Untapped, and I've just been very tentative into it. I need to learn a lot more to call myself a connoisseur. I'll settle for calling myself a beer fan. There's so much more I need to learn about it, and so much more I'd like to learn about it. And so, yeah, thankfully it's It's a wonderful thing to research. And I find whenever I come back to the Midwest, there's always a new brewery that, well, frankly, I have to check out.
All right, thank you. So there are a ton of Minnesota Easter eggs or references that you include in the book. Um,
Yeah.
it was so fun for readers. I know when I was reading it, I would kind of laugh out loud or be like, "Oh, Heggy's Pizza," or "Oh, Dessa, he got in there," or the
Yeah. Yeah.
signature Vikings move where they lose the game by missing a field goal. Um, so, did you have any that you were just like, "I have to put this in," or what were some of your favorites?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a few right there. All of those references to a few restaurants, that have sadly come and gone even before the pandemic, or gone. They had been around for quite a while. In one case, a restaurant called Barbary Fig, which was a North African uh, restaurant in St. Paul on Grand Avenue. It was my first time going to that restaurant in high school. Was my first experience to things like shakshuka and tagine and just lamb, just basically a whole lot of food. That was a really eye-opening restaurant to me, and I would go back there the rest of my life. I made a point of eating there. One guy ran it, did all of the cooking, made all of the meals for its entire existence, and he closed it a few years ago. And I wanted to set a scene there, like out of my appreciation for that restaurant, but also, tracing some restaurant history and some food and beer history throughout the book by planting certain beers that were era appropriate in certain places, or like the Ficker's beer that Helen has at the beginning. Mentions of Cold Spring Brewery, mentions of Shells throughout. Um, and also, how that brewery has changed. Uh, there's a boutique label within Shells that makes small production beer, and one of those beers is mentioned um, in one of Diana's chapters. So, yeah, just infusing the geography. Setting Helen's Brewery in Point Douglas, which is an area in unincorporated, technically a ghost town, I think. Um, Wikipedia calls it one anyway. Really close to where I grew up, so I was always going through St. Douglas, like to the beach on the St. Croix River right there, or crossing over into Wisconsin. You have to go through Point Douglas. I'm sorry if I call it St. Douglas. Point Douglas, and there was it used to be a bowling alley there that my friends and I would go to a lot. And there's a nature center, Carpenter Nature Center, that's right there. So when I thought about where to set the brewery, I thought, oh, it's going to be there. It's going to be in this like unincorporated area that I know well. And the supper club down the road where they serve the beer is another restaurant called The Point that just closed a couple of years ago as well. And so all these places were known to me, and they were like they weren't arbitrary decisions in terms of, oh, where am I going to put this brewery, or where are they going to eat afterwards? Like, yeah, I every proper noun in there, I put a lot of thought into. Right down to a fictional beer mentioned in the very end of the last chapter, like Prairie Page IPA. It's a reference to a bookstore in Pierce, South Dakota called Prairie Pages. Yeah, just little things like that. Anytime there's a proper noun, or a lot of character names, or names that are portmanteaus, or mashups of people I went to high school with, people I went to college with, and people who influenced me and been helpful to me throughout my life and career. So yeah, the whole book is basically a thank you note and a love letter to the Midwest and its people and places.
Thank you. That's great. I know in reading it, I had to look up Ripple. I was like, Ripple, what's
Oh yeah,
Ripple?
yeah, yeah.
So,
My grandma kind of liked that stuff. I
okay,
remembered it from when
okay.
I was a little kid. I don't think I haven't seen it in a long
No,
time.
no.
I
So,
looked for it, but yeah, I remember my grandma kind of liking it.
all right. So, In reading the book, I can totally see it as like a movie or a TV series in a way. Is there any talk
Oh,
of
cool.
it being picked up or anything like that?
Yeah, I've got a production company. I can't discuss it yet because
Ooh.
nothing is, it's still in clay form, but I have optioned it to a production company that's trying to develop it as a TV series. And that's as far as I can go. Yeah, but yeah, it's in the pipeline. You know, there's a possibility it'll happen. But I can't say more, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, cool. That's good to know. That's
Yeah,
exciting.
it'd be wonderful.
It would
Thank
be.
you. Yeah. 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 I know, having worked in television for a while, the vast unlikelihood of things getting produced. Even if it's a good idea and the right people are on board, there's still reasons it won't happen. Yeah, circumstances emerge. People leave the project. People enter. You know, all kinds of, you name it. It's like having a second grade classroom create a 5 course meal. You know, technically it's possible. You know, it's but hey, it's really easy for them to get it wrong. Really easy for something to go haywire. Yeah. Or to go, as my Uncle Paul says, cattywampus, you know? Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like it's out of my control at this point, and I'll enjoy it if it happens. Yeah.
Super. Yeah, that'd be great to see. How about anything you are working on now? What can we look forward
Oh,
to
wow.
from you?
Yeah. I'm working on my third book right now. It's currently with my editor. I'm awaiting notes on it. It's set primarily within the realm of supper clubs, which are common throughout the upper Midwest, particularly Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota. But there's a few supper clubs throughout the Great Lakes area, and I've always been really intrigued with that particular style of restaurant and how they've held on to certain traditions or practices for generations. And just like the independent breweries I wrote about tend to be family owned, locally owned and operated, and have a persistence of staff, and also operate in a lot of cases as community meeting places or traditional places where people will celebrate one occasion or the other. And I always wanted to use one as a setting. So my next book primarily is set in a supper club in northern Minnesota. There's also another restaurant um, represented in the book, a new one that's kind of based on a Perkins or Baker Square style model of like a bakery based family restaurant. And it's a love story largely. The new one, there's a child from one supper club family that gets involved with a child from the Perkins Baker Square style restaurant family, and they meet and fall in love. And yeah, just how those restaurants have changed or not changed, and how they react to changes in what diners are expecting or demanding, or is kind of the spine of the story. But once again, it's a multi-generational family story, like just like with Lager Queen, where beer is kind of the setting. It's not really the subject. Once again, the subject is Midwestern people and how we behave and how we react to each other and how we help each other. And yeah, I set out to write another book that made me happy, and I hope it. I hope we can get back to work on it soon and start working on my fourth book, which I already have an idea for.
Awesome. That's great. Well, we look forward to everything that you have in the works there.
Well,
Um,
thanks.
I'm trying to think. That might be the last question we have. Looking over my list here. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and we so appreciate you taking your time and doing this virtually for us. And again, we would have loved to have you in person, and we'll still kind of keep that in the back of our mind and hope that we can make it happen in the future.
I sure hope so. Yeah. Thank you again for selecting Lager Queen as the one book, one community. And I reflect your statement that Oh, man, I wish I could be out there, especially this time of year. I love autumn in the Midwest, and it'd be a wonderful time to celebrate this season with you guys. But in the future, absolutely, I can't wait to come out and meet in person and meet any readers, anyone watching right now in person. So I promise you that I'll do it.
All right. Well, thank you again. And we look forward to future visits with you.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Lori, and thanks to everyone in Fargo Moorhead and everyone at the library in the city of Fargo. Thanks again.